Travis Brown is an independent filmmaker living in the Pacific Northwest. He is the president of the Signal Education Project, which is a nonprofit that creates engaging content that shines a light on how dogma and tribalism distort the truth. Since leaving his religious faith behind, he has been interested in how religious and political ideology shape our view of reality, how ideology affects our conversations, and what it does to relationships and society as a whole. His previous work includes the Woke Reformation, which features Peter Boghossian, Douglas Murray, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Vivek Ramaswamy, and many other brave intellectuals. He is currently exploring the difficult topic of gender identity in his upcoming docuseries, Uncomfortable Truths: The Reality of Gender Identity Ideology. During our interview, we discussed the problems with the paradigm of good versus evil, and what makes a mindset inherently totalitarian. We also explore his journey from Christianity to atheism, pseudo-sacred texts that deem some of our fellow people as possessors of original sin, and attempts to avoid self-righteousness no matter what beliefs you hold, reflecting on the famed Friedrich Nietzsche quote, "He who fights with monsters must take care, lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." I'm Sienna Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty. Something I really admire about your style of filmmaking is that you weave parts of your hero's journey into the interviews that you do, into the interviews that you conduct with some really impressive voices in the dissident space, all the while acknowledging the harm that's being caused by critical race theory and gender identity theory in practice. So I'd like to take some time to kind of just like focus on your journey and get into your creative process, and then maybe get more into like the meat of the issues themselves. Well, as an atheist, you express concern about the active belief in cosmic forces of good and evil, and both spiritually and racially, really thinking in terms of black and white can lend itself to be, as you've said, an inherently totalitarian belief system. And yet you also perceive a certain darkness in the topics that you're exploring. And I've seen you speak to a dark truth rather recently that you see in relation to the surgeries being performed on minors. So I'd love to explore this good versus evil paradigm with you and get a sense of that dark truth. What is the dark truth that you're grappling with just after filming Uncomfortable Truths on the trans phenomenon?
Yeah, so there are a number of, I suppose you could call them dark truths about just what's happening, especially to kids, but also the way in which this kind of self-ID of particularly men identifying themselves as women and entering into women's spaces and being abusive and sometimes not even being abusive, but just taking over, which I guess is perhaps a form of abuse, but just sort of taking over women's spaces, whether it's sports or prisons or, whatever, encroaching on female rights. So I guess that there are a number of them. That's why I called it Uncomfortable Truths. And it's a series. Part one is currently out. So it's not a single film, but it'll actually be a multiple installment series. And the first one in the first episode, I start to dive into this topic and try to help people along the path of understanding what's going on, because one of the things that makes it so dark and twisted, in my view, is that so many people see transgender medicine and this idea of being trans as the new civil rights frontier. And I think that's as soon as you start scratching the surface and understanding what's really going on, it becomes very dark, because you have all these people pushing for medicalizing children, and whether they know it or not, sterilizing them, chopping off their body parts, literally. And so and then they're doing it in the name of inclusion and progress. So that's particularly dark and twisted.
Yeah, fair enough. And building on this theme of dark and light, we might say, and how that relates to perhaps spirituality and faith. I know that your story involves growing up in a Christian household where you experienced a sense of belonging. And, like many of us, you've been on your own journey, setting yourself apart and finding yourself as an individual, and now calling yourself an atheist. What has been your journey mentally and spiritually out of that environment? And how do you create meaning in your work rather than seeking it outside of yourself?
Firstly, I mean, I'm technically an atheist. I'm okay with the word, but it's not like an identity that's important to me. It's not a label that I'm constantly giving myself, or I'm not trying to tell people I'm an atheist. All it means to me is that I lack belief in a supernatural deity, and it doesn't really tell you anything about where I get my sense of meaning or about my philosophy on life or really anything else. Some people may argue that it does. If I'm lacking a particular faith, they may pigeonhole me in a particular way. But I don't think it's true that being an atheist means that you believe in anything in particular. It just means you lack a belief. And so, given that, I actually do in some ways lament the decline of traditional religion, because it was something, and it still is for some, that gave people direction and a sense of purpose and connected them to something bigger than themselves. And I think we all need that. I just take issue personally with this idea that the thing that we need to be connected to needs to exist in another realm, essentially. I just don't believe in that other realm. And so for me, that's something that is infused in a lot of the work that I do. I try to focus on, okay, what are the more positive things? I'm covering these dark topics, children being indoctrinated, whether it's with critical race theory or Black Lives Matter propaganda or gender ideology. So I always like to at least touch on something a little bit more positive, like, okay, we have a lot of people who are trying to find a foundation of purpose and meaning, and they do it in a way that's really destructive. They're not using traditional religion. However, sometimes traditionally religious people do get caught up in these kind of woke mind viruses, whether it's gender or race or any of those identity politics topics. But I think it's really important to explore those ideas of meaning outside of a supernatural context, because I think a lot of us just don't believe, and we're not going to believe. Some people come back to faith or come to faith, but a lot of people just won't. And so that just, as a practical, pragmatic matter, it means that a lot of people really need to ground themselves in something more stable, not get caught up with identity politics and all this nonsense. I think you also asked how I left my faith. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm curious about that as well.
Yeah. So it was a really slow process. I grew up with fundamentalist Christians kind of dictating what I could say and what I could do, and even my thought processes. Like, I remember being told many times that meditating was evil because clearing your mind just allowed space for the devil to enter it. Right? Well, it turns out meditating is actually really good for you, and it helps, I think, in a lot of ways to ground a person and to let go of this kind of ephemeral attachments that can lead people astray, and it helps with emotional regulation and all kinds of things. But there were just a number of things in the Bible and things that I was taught at church and at the private Christian school that I went to, and directly from my parents and the community I grew up in, that were just really, in my view, immoral and harmful. It was it really was authoritarian in a lot of ways. And a lot of that just didn't sit well with me. I still believed in all of it. I thought, if I stop praying, if I stop believing, if I turn my back on God, then I'm going to go to hell. And so that was a really, really difficult decision to leave that behind, because even as I was leaving it behind, I still believed at the time that I was putting myself in serious peril. So it was extremely difficult, but it was too immoral to me. It just didn't sit right with me in so many ways. And then eventually I learned about empiricism and epistemology and discovered that there's no actual empirical evidence for these things. And that provided me with quite a bit of relief. And so ultimately leaving my faith behind actually gave me more fulfillment and less anxiety in a lot of ways.
So it felt more authentic for you to go your own way and leave behind that sort of zealous certainty that you were raised with.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it for sure.
And some might say that without a faith-based framework, then one is left without a moral framework. And I've heard you say in some of your recorded segments that in our society we do have competing ethical values and moral frameworks. I think that's very easy and plain to see.
Yeah.
But you strike me as a principled person. I don't believe in like such black and white thinking that you have to believe in God to be a good person or to practice good morals. What would you say are your primary guiding values? And do you believe in any sort of like moral objectivism or objective reality?
Yeah, I believe in both of those things. I mean, objective reality, as it's been said, is that which exists regardless of whether or not you believe in it. So, if I wanted to jump off a building and think that I could fly, I'm going to fall either way, even if in my mind I'm, convinced that I'm going to fly. So clearly there's an objective reality, and gender ideology certainly intrudes on that, saying that people can change sex and boys who like to be feminine are actually girls. So yeah, I think it's just so obvious that there's an objective reality. However, getting to what that is, we all have to be very humble about, because we only know we know very very little about it. I think just the fact that it exists is pretty indisputable. And in terms of objective moral standards, yeah, I think in terms of I think there are obvious ethical frameworks within a functional society that if we ignore will cause harm. I think that's just obvious. Some of the details on what those morals are can and should be debated, but I think it's pretty clear that, for instance, sterilizing children, unless it's to save their lives because they're dying of cancer, but doing it just electively is an immoral thing to do objectively. Or, there have been others who have argued that we can and do have objective standards of morality. For instance, there have been instances in the Islamic world where women who take off their hijab are, splashed in the face with acid. I think that's immoral, regardless of whatever spiritual belief system or religion one adheres to or not. It's clearly causing that woman harm and is morally abhorrent. And I think all this equivocating about, oh, you need to have some kind of foundation that's supernatural or beyond yours. I just don't understand how or why that's necessary. I mean, it's very clear that that's painful, awful, and despicable. I just don't see why we need to. I think we can ground morality in objective facts. I think that can be really difficult because we don't know all the facts, but I think certain things are clear. And I would say we wouldn't exist as a species if evolution didn't imbue in us some kind of, some kind of sense of morality of tit for tat or right and wrong. So I just don't even think we would have made it this far if we didn't have some kind of inherent guide.
Hmm. Well, while I think to some degree morality is inherent, or I would like to believe that, there's also negative traits to our
Of
persons that
course.
are
Yeah.
inherent. One being our susceptibility to groupthink. I mean, I believe that we're all susceptible to groupthink and to the zealot mentality, if you will. In recent years, we've heard it called the mass formation. I don't know if you've heard that term.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. And some believe like that this relatively small group of individuals is special in some way, or that like we're closer to God or whatever, closer to
Yeah.
nearer to ourselves or something. But I'm not sure I agree with that, or at least not anymore, because um it's my understanding, like research shows that any person can find themselves in that small group. Any person can find themselves in the middle, maybe feeling like there's something not right, but too shy or I don't like that word either, but just not speaking up for whatever reason, or just completely caught up in the groupthink. Um, do you feel like our relatively small group of people who are standing up to these pervasive ideologies are unique in some way? Do you feel like there's something that we have in common, or is it kind of just random?
Yeah. I mean, I think different people come at it for different reasons in terms of why identity politics and woke ideology bothers them. I think, regardless of why people are attuned to the fact that these ideologies are causing problems, I think being aware that they are causing problems is a good thing, no matter what. But also, as you said, we're all susceptible to groupthink, and probably all of us participate into it to some degree or another, or just personal biases. There are many biases. Daniel Kahneman has written extensively about this. Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about these sorts of things. So it's pretty clear that we're all biased, and we are a kind of tribal species. So I think it's natural for us to want to group together, which you see on the anti-woke side, and the sort of gender critical side. You see a lot of people starting to engage in groupthink, starting to engage in, even worse, dogpiling on people for not holding the perfectly correct view. People policing pronouns who are not trans rights activists, but the gender critical people, policing my pronouns of what I call people, what I decide. And so really, I think it's really more of a battle between who's authoritarian and who's not. Frankly, I think sometimes what gets missed in that conversation is the fact that we are inherently a tribal species, and that's not entirely bad, because we need community and we need to be connected to something greater than ourselves. I think where that goes awry is as you were saying before, is if people start to join in this black and white thinking about all of their beliefs. I think there are objective moral standards, and you have to take stances on certain things, but not willing to even engage with somebody, not being willing to engage with somebody, or willing to consider a different opinion, I think is where the problem comes in. And more particularly, the problem is when you want to control what other people can think and say and do. When it comes to children, that's a separate issue, because they're not adults, they're not fully autonomous, and we do have to have safeguards in place there. But when it comes to fully functioning, mentally healthy adults, I think the lines are drawn between those who are more individualistic and who want liberty and freedom for everyone, including themselves and the people they don't agree with, versus the people who are more authoritarian and who are drawn to try to control what you can say, and making sure you have the right opinions and say the right things and don't cross this line. So
for the sake of the greater good, you must use correct pronouns, whether you're on one side or the other. I mean, yeah. I can relate to one of those sides for sure. But sure. Another thing I've seen commandeered is virtues. Like, for instance, timeliness being considered a white virtue.
Right. Objectivity. And I know,
yeah, pretty much objectivity in itself, or just all around positive traits that don't cause harm or that benefit society and the individual. But I was actually hearkening back to a scene from the Woke Reformation, your film, in which there's a depiction of two colleagues, and one white woman is saying to an African-American woman, "Wow, I'm so proud of you for coming in on time." And I think something everyone has in common is they don't like to be patronized.
Right.
Right. And meanwhile, even complimenting someone on their outfit, saying like, "Oh, you look beautiful," or "I love your hair." Like, nowadays, that can have a political connotation. Like, the person giving the compliment, are they just trying to prove that they're not racist, that they're anti-racist?
Right.
And our very fundamental just interactions, or day to day, complimenting each other, especially with women, I have to say, that's a way that we relate. And I'm curious, in your creative process in creating the Woke Reformation and likewise Uncomfortable Truths, what is a piece of wisdom that you've garnered from these interviews on how we may more respectfully interact with one another?
Yeah, that's a good question. To your comment earlier about people being so uptight, I just feel like people just need to settle down and just relax a little bit. But and that will actually help people engage in conversations in a better way. Not being so willing and eager and ready to be offended. And again, this is, like I said, we all have biases. I fall into this myself, where I see somebody that has some kind of sign or signal that they're on the opposing side. And so immediately I click into this mode of thinking like, okay, well, I probably don't agree with that person. And maybe, you know, in my mind, maybe even unconsciously, I'm going to like shun them a little bit. And I have to try to work on that myself, because I think we should all try to do that. We should all try to put those biases aside as much as humanly possible in order to have productive dialogue. And you know, sometimes people take that too far in the sense that they think that they need to try to have productive dialogue with absolutely anyone. But we do have mentally unwell people out there who are absolutely unwilling to engage in any kind of rational dialogue, or they are clearly just out to lie, slander, you know, abuse other people. And those people don't need to be talked with. You know, other people can talk with them if they want, but I don't need to waste my time talking with those people. And I don't think anyone needs to do that. However, obviously, for a productive society, most of us are willing to engage. Most of us are more moderate. We're not in the, whatever it is, 8 to 12% of the extreme left or extreme right. And so I think we should keep in mind that we don't know someone's opinion just because they happen to be part of a group or ostensibly part of a group. And sometimes those people aren't part of that group, even if we think they are because of something in their Twitter bio or whatever. And again, I fall prey to that same faulty thinking. But I think just laying aside some of those prejudices will certainly go a long ways. And just assume it's almost impossible to do online, but in person, assuming good faith on the part of the person that you're talking to, assuming that, you know, maybe they've thought about something and have some knowledge about something that you don't have, is also a really good way to approach those kinds of difficult conversations.
I think one good example of someone who can approach those conversations willingly is philosopher Peter Boghossian, who you've worked closely with and who's been featured in your films. And I found hope in his segments, and specifically like when he has people stand on a spectrum of agreement to disagreement.
Right.
On a question. Like the most recent one I saw was, do you think that fewer people would transition if they had to wait until age 25? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that question. But more broadly, like, what do you find constructive or helpful about that approach that Peter takes?
Yeah, I was actually the one that posed that question or that claim, and I was the one that engaged with him on it, because his take on that has always, I hang out with him a lot, and I film all of those conversations, and Reed and I go around the world with him and do that spectrum street epistemology stuff. So I was just interested in his thoughts on that, because I've heard him say, oh, you know, when you're an 18, you can do whatever you want. And for the most part, I agree with that. But I think that given, one, the gender identity ideology and how pervasive it is and how easily young people are indoctrinated into it, and given the fact that there are a lot of mentally unwell people that get drawn to gender identity, and the additional fact of these surgeons and doctors and clinicians going along with this ideology because they think it's progressive and or because they want to make money off of it. You know, there are new surgeries for people all the time. There's now a surgery for eunuchs because apparently that's a legitimate category. So, you know, I believe, I could be incorrect about this, but I'm pretty sure they're creating new ICD-10 codes, which are insurance codes for a lot of these things, which, by the way, so far, there are not ICD-10 codes for detransitioners, for people who feel like they've made a mistake and want to get help in correcting that mistake. My friend Camille Kiefel is a detransitioner. She pointed that out to me. But yeah, so I suggested maybe the age should be 25 before people, you know, quote unquote, transition or take cross-sex hormones and get surgeries. That's what I mean by transition, because no one can, obviously no one can change sex. I thought 25 because I don't know we've had a really good conversation, at least not lately, about what makes a person an adult. And I think basing it on the fact that the brain is more or less fully developed at about 25, 26, the front prefrontal cortex is fully developed at that age. And you just start to see, I mean, experientially, I think we all sort of realize that in a person's mid-20s is when they start acting a little bit more rationally. They're a little bit less into partying. They're a little bit less into, you know, they're kind of getting their lives in order. And so it just seems reasonable to me to want to postpone that particular set of, you know, surgeries and hormones until that age, with the hope that fewer people would regret their transition. That's the main reason. And it's tricky because there aren't many legal precedents, you know, for the most part, at least in the United States, people are considered fully adult if they're 18. However, there are certain instances, like I don't believe you can rent a car until you're 25. And so there are certain cases where that is actually implemented. So I don't know, why not, gender medicine? That's my thinking on that.
Hmm. And just picturing that approach that Peter takes of having people standing on a spectrum of agreement to disagreement. I'm just curious, what points of view do you represent on this topic in your film, Uncomfortable Truths?
What point do I represent personally?
No, I mean, what points rather do you illustrate in the interviews that you conducted?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I interviewed, I think, 20 plus people, everyone from Helen Joyce to Stella O'Malley to, as I mentioned, some, detransitioners, as well as parents who've lost children or helped their child desist, which means no longer believe that they're trans and feel comfortable with their sex body. So yeah, mostly, I also tried to get interviews with people who were more on the gender affirming side of things. That is, therapists and clinicians who think it's fine to push these things on children, or think that kids or anyone can be truly trans. Those people tend to not want to talk to me, unfortunately, so I couldn't really represent that side. The only way to do that, I mean, I'd like to try to read and watch as much as possible on both sides of an argument before I make a film or a series about it. So I do highlight some of those, in my view, rather deranged points of view through news clips and statistics and things like that. Because, often in this space, when you make an argument against something, people will immediately retort, well, no one actually believes that. No one actually thinks that, whether it's critical race theory or it's gender medicine or any of these topics, people will just say, well, no one's actually transitioning children. That's not actually happening. So the only way I could really represent that was happening is by scouring the internet for many, many, many hours, countless hours, and showing that people are doing this and saying this. But yeah, so my primary hope in making this series was just to get people to pause and to think about this a little bit more critically. And with the great guests, interviewees that I have on the series, I think that they do that really, really well. I think they're all really quite balanced in terms of their perspective. None of them hate, trans-identified people. They're all just very concerned about people's physical and mental well-being. And so that's my hope. So I was just trying to lay out like what's actually happening and then explain why it's a problem. So those are the main 2 points.
Yeah, fair enough. And reflecting on the woke Reformation again, I really appreciated the part that acknowledges the parallel between the early witch hunts and the modern day witch hunt that we're experiencing now, and the former being spread via the printing press and the current one being spread by the internet. Could you share more about that parallel? Like, how is it portrayed in the film, and your exploration of the effects of gender identity theory? Like, are you finding also a parallel there?
Yeah. So I was lucky enough to interview Neil Ferguson, the great historian, brilliant guy. I really enjoyed talking with him, and he's the one that came up with the comparison of, the printing press being a new technology that allowed some ideas to spread that would not have otherwise spread, and for the most part, that was a really positive thing. But it obviously it led to the Protestant Reformation, and then he compared that to today, where the internet, social media, and smartphones in particular, this is now a new technology or set of technologies that have allowed a new reformation of sorts, the woke Reformation, to sort of take hold. And in my view, it's been almost entirely negative. And so, yeah, it is interesting how these new technologies help ideas proliferate, and how sometimes that's really good and sometimes that's it's not so good. Interestingly enough, I would say that the witch hunt is really more on the gender critical side. It's more of like, well, if you don't fully agree with this particular side, we're going to find you out and we're going to shame you and we're going to, call you a witch, which is unfortunate. And I think that's just part of the human psyche. We're just always trying to find people who don't agree with us and, kind of out them. I mean, obviously that does happen when it comes to people who don't agree with, medical procedures for children, or who don't think that men should enter into women's spaces. That does also happen. So it happens kind of on both sides. And, in almost every way, I think it's worse when it comes to the trans rights activists and the fact that they're trying to kind of punish people for not going along with this, and out them to their coworkers or their boss, or just on social media or whatever. Clearly it has some drastically negative effects, because they do want to silence dissent in that way. So I don't know if it's perfectly analogous to the witch hunt, but there's a lot of people sort of feeling uneasy that they can't speak out against gender identity ideology, or feel like, like my musician, for instance, brilliant musician who makes the music for everything I do. This person can't put their name on my series because they're worried about living in Portland, Oregon, and, being outed as a heretic, basically. So yeah, it's almost more along the lines of finding heretics and being heretical than it is a witch hunt, I think.
I have heard women on the I am one of them, like on the gender critical side, express that they feel like they're being hunted as witches, or that they see, primary figures such as J.K. Rowling being hunted as if she's a witch. I do see that. Sure. And I do see the gender critical side as a response to, the what I would say is like the irrational trans ideologues are trying to,
Totally.
basically enforce, men in women's spaces. And I guess I sort of empathize more, but maybe, I have my own biases there. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the dynamics at play on both sides or across a spectrum of belief. I think it's tough because on this issue, while race, I think, is a more nuanced issue, and race itself and ethnicity is actually a spectrum. Believe it or not, I'm half Middle Eastern. It's like, surprise, like I like present a certain way, but it's not the same with sex or gender, if that's what you want to call it. So it is a very binary thing. It's like it's hard to find a solution when it's like, well, if there's one woman that says no, you can't have a man in my space, or if, for that matter, if a man is like, I don't want a woman in my space.
Right.
I think from a moral standpoint, that's that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I don't disagree. The unfortunate things, while I agree mostly with a lot of the gender critical people, I've been attacked just for having people who identify as trans, like Buck Angel in my series, or Stella O'Malley, who runs GenSpect. And I've had conversations with some of these people just pointing out, like, wow, it's just unfortunate to me that there's this kind of civil war on the gender critical side of things, and they demonize people like Stella, even though she's doing great work, helping detransitioners, helping people lost in transition, as they say.
Oh, why? Pardon me, but why do they demonize her?
Well, whatever I say will be misrepresented, unfortunately. Okay. I've tried to have this conversation, but the reality is, for instance, at the last GenSpect conference, which is the international organization that Stella helps run, there was a self-identified autogynephile, which is a man who gets a sexual kick out of dressing as a woman. And, lots of photos were being taken, and one went online, and I'm kind of tired of talking about this stupid controversy, but everyone was saying, oh, look at Stella, she's platforming this AGP, and he spoke there and he wrote books, and none of that was true. None of that was true. He was just there. There was a picture with a detransitioner, Laura, who wanted the photo, and then everyone was saying, oh, look at this poor vulnerable detransitioner speaking for Laura, and Laura's like, no, I wanted the photo. This guy was nice to me, there was no problem. He didn't use women's toilets. He didn't. In my view, that whole thing is creepy, and I agree there, and I think it's weird, but a lot of this is just based on lies. It's based on misrepresenting the truth, and so I guess again, it just comes to like this: our groupthink and our inability to not be nuanced. And you're right, when it comes to sex, it is binary, and so there's not a lot of nuance when it comes to, I personally think that trying to transition children is pretty much as bad as pedophilia, and I don't think that there's an argument for either one. So to me, that is a very black and white issue. The same for single sex spaces. I think they should be kept single space, or single sex. And so I do also think fairly black and white on some of those issues. However, what I don't want to do is immediately write someone off just because they slightly disagree with me about something a little bit outside of those main two issues. And that's what I find just kind of unfortunate about some of the gender critical side, if that makes sense.
Fair enough. Yeah. The controversy sounds sketchy. I don't know about it, so I'm not going to offer an opinion. Besides, I agree. Autogynephiles are gross. More broadly, when we talk about like approaching at least most people with good faith, do you think that all people have good intentions?
Do all people have good intentions? I guess it depends on how you define good. I mean, there are obviously sociopaths and psychopaths, and I think you could define their intentions as not good because they don't have the emotional attachments that all of us do, and they don't mind intentionally using people as pawns and trying to get their way in whatever way they want. But outside of that, I think at least in their own minds, generally speaking, people do have good intentions. Whether or not that equates to good for, whether you call it the greater good or just something that's actually moral, that's another question. Because obviously people with good intentions can do really, really horrible things. So I think you have to look at the outcome of the actions and the behavior. So, yeah.
Everyone's the hero of their own story.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think good intentions matter when damage is being done? And if so, to what degree?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the woke people will say, well, no, it's impact over intent. And, there's like maybe a kernel of truth in the sense that, as I just laid out, you do have to consider the impact of a person's actions. However, in a lot of these cases, that is used as a trope, in so many instances. For instance, there was a piece of rope hanging from, I think it was in California, hanging from a tree, and all these people started saying it was a noose and that it was, to scare Black people. And, there were press conferences held about it. And even though the person who put it up said, no, this was like, I think it was some signifier. I don't remember what it was. It had nothing to do with lynching people. It was not a noose. But people were saying, well, all that matters is the impact. Well, that's not really true in this case. It may be a case by case basis, but I think generally speaking, we should ask what somebody's intent is. We should clarify what that is, because often people are just doing things in an innocuous way and they don't have a negative or harmful intent. And I think we obviously have to consider that.
Righteousness, specifically, I think of like Christian righteousness, can come from good intentions and from nuggets of truth, and at times have then caused restrictions on individual liberties. How does Christian righteousness compare with the righteousness you see exhibited in the realm of gender identity, both from the ideologues and perhaps those who oppose it in the gender critical space?
Yeah, well, I think self-righteousness is a thing that transcends religion or religious affiliation or being non-religious. So that's just a fact of human psychology. So people can be self-righteous and then take on the mantle of whether they're doing it for God or they're doing it for Jesus as a Christian or any other religion or in any other space. So any ideology can kind of lend itself to a person who wants to be self-righteous, and I think that people like to appear as pure, and then kind of impose their stringent moral standards on everyone else, and then act in a self-righteous way if those are not adhered to. So clearly that happens with trans rights activists and their progressive allies. They're saying that, well, if kids can grow up and be gay, then kids can also obviously be trans, and so therefore we need to give them puberty blockers, we need to give them cross-sex hormones and surgeries. Anyone who disagrees with that is labeled as evil, essentially, often, unfortunately. And so, yeah, those people can obviously be very self-righteous, thinking that, we're causing harm by delaying what a kid supposedly needs. But it turns out so many of these kids of their own accord desist, that is, stop identifying as the opposite sex. And with the right treatment, the right psychological treatment and emotional treatment, as well as sometimes physical health interventions, looking at inflammatory markers, et cetera, they probably all will desist at some point, I think, if given the right help. So I think that, using righteousness as kind of a bludgeon to get other people to do what you want is not wise.
Mm. The famous quote from Nietzsche comes to mind: "He who fights with monsters must take care lest he thereby become a monster. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you."
Right.
And when holding such fundamental truth as the existence of only two sexes, each of us having only male or female gametes, it can pose a challenge to not become a version of the opposition. Because again, like, this is what many of us would say is a binary issue, nuanced in practice, but binary in reality. And by a version of the opposition, what I really mean is like a version of the monster that Nietzsche points
I think
to.
we're seeing that, yeah. Unfortunately.
And the monster not being people specifically, but the harm of the surgeries and the inversions of truth that you're fighting. And even more deeply, I think one aspect of the monster that you've pointed to is victim consciousness, and the solution being a victor mindset. And in the culture of the woke, the more oppressed person is deemed the arbiter of truth. And then we're faced with like rigid and dogmatic beliefs that are entrenched in this sort of inescapable hopelessness. It's like there's no way out. There's no solution. There's no cure. It's just perpetual sin, especially if you're a straight white man, or a TERF in the case of gender identity theory. So when you acknowledge this fundamental truth of the existence of two sexes, how can you do so without falling into the same trap of creating a new reformation?
Well, I guess I would say that up until recently, almost everyone just knew intuitively, whether they would call it gender or sex doesn't really matter. They're essentially talking about the same thing, that there are two sexes. There are, males and females, and some people have known about what are called intersex people, or just people with DSDs, disorders of sexual development, that are very rare, but they have almost nothing to do really with the trans ideology, the gender identity ideology. But in terms of, not sort of becoming monstrous, or again, I'm coming back to this idea of being authoritarian. I don't think we have to be authoritarian to acknowledge that there is a binary option when it comes to sex. And I think that's, like I said, it's been obvious to people for thousands of years. And so in a way, it's almost like all we really need to do is go back to what we all agreed to 20, 30 years ago. And I don't think a person has to be authoritarian in that. I do think that there should be some laws, again, like I said, safeguarding children. And so that's where I split with some of the gender critical people, is that, I've had some of them say, well, unless you ban these surgeries for adults, they won't be banned for children. And I don't really understand that. I think that people can think about it as a cosmetic surgery, or however they want to frame it. But I don't want to be authoritarian. I don't want to tell people what they can and can't do with their bodies when they're adults. I don't advocate for it. I advocate against it. Just like I'm not really pro-abortion, but I'm not going to advocate for making abortion illegal. There are a number of things that kind of fall into that category where, I have my own personal opinion and view of morality about some of these things, but I don't want this third party, the government, to force people into situations that they don't want to be in and to control other people's lives. So that's my view. I think if people can advocate for what they think is the right way to live in the world, but not force, demand, and otherwise, ostracize people if they don't agree. I think that should be our goal, personally.
I think this is one of the most challenging topics of our time because um, telling a man that he can't come into a woman's space can be interpreted as shunning and can be experienced as shunning. And
Sure.
I see it sort of that way, and from that perspective, I really understand it. Um, so I really don't know what the solution is because even having certain laws in place, aside from the surgeries, actually, just plain laws that like you have to go into a space associated with your sex can be seen as authoritarian, and it maybe could be authoritarian. Because
Well,
if
I
enough
guess,
people don't agree, and then there's a minority who aren't, perhaps, if it's groupthink and there's a majority of people who are like, no, trans rights matter and all that,
right.
then it would be a minority enforcing their opinion, or, what we would say would be objective fact onto the masses.
Yeah, I guess the line to draw there is whether or not it's impinging upon other people's rights. And so when men enter into women's spaces or women into men's spaces, like I interviewed Mr. Minot, a gay guy in the UK who has talked about, these trans men or women who identify as men entering into, gay spaces and and so I'm sympathetic to both, just keeping single sex spaces for both men and women, for men and women. And I do think that when it comes to, I think it is perfectly reasonable to have that third party, the government, whatever overseeing body, to enact certain laws that do protect people from other people's authoritarian wishes. So when somebody, even if they're a minority, wants to say, well, I identify as a woman, therefore I can enter your space and get naked with you, whatever, I think we as a society have an obligation to stop that from happening, because again, it's impinging upon other people's rights. So if they wanted to identify as a woman in the privacy of their own lives and their own homes, and they weren't harming anyone, then that's where I would say, what's the problem? I mean, maybe they're delusional. Maybe they personally might be better if they didn't do that. Maybe they would find more meaning or happiness or whatever. But I'm not going to force that person to conform to wearing male typical clothes or thinking of themselves as a masculine man or what. I don't care. What I care about is whether or not people are forcing themselves onto other people. So again, this idea of this sort of third party adjudicating these things, I think it's really good that we have that. Obviously governments can overstep their bounds very easily and often do, but it's a very good thing that we have laws in place, because that helps adjudicate these problems and it helps keep people's autonomy and liberty intact.
And I think what we're seeing here, which I understand that you agree, is we're seeing an abuse of power, and like you just put it, we're seeing a forcing.
Yeah.
And when one experiences an abuse of power, I think associating with the abuser victim paradigm kind of helps the victim make sense of the situation. But then at the same time, victim consciousness, which is all too pervasive in our society, really reigns, and it does so in a very destructive way. And I wonder if like it's just a natural progression of power, that it's possible for those fighting the monster to become another version of the monster, and it will just be a constant power struggle. And then meanwhile, like, in relation with race, which is all in this postmodern soup, we have the pseudo-sacred texts deeming the straight white man as the possessor of original sin, the ultimate oppressor. And then we
Right.
see, like, with trans ideology, basically like a straight white man can identify as a woman, and like there he goes, like he could,
Yeah.
it's like a loophole. And I wonder if trans ideology is an attempt, subconscious attempt to rid society of the straight white man's original sin, and if it's like trying to fill a God-shaped hole in our society.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the first part. I don't know if anyone intentionally set out to do that. However, I will say that I think it's pretty clear that after 2020 and the George Floyd riots and that woke ideology exploding into the mainstream, and then more and more like classrooms being segregated by race by progressives, and more demonizing of white people, especially white heterosexual males. Of course, young boys are going to see that and think, "Oh, I don't, I don't want to be an oppressor. That's terrible." So even if those young boys are not consciously choosing to be queer or gender expansive or trans, I have to think that some of this ideology leads kids to want to identify out of the oppressor role. And we see that, as you said, victims are kind of, made sacred. So why wouldn't you want to appear as a victim and therefore have an elevated status? So I think there are a number of reasons that have led to, and that's just one of the reasons that have led to the explosion of trans ideology being adopted by so many people. And yeah, I do, in the first episode of my series, Uncomfortable Truths, I do touch on this idea that because traditional religion has declined, at least in part because of that, people are seeking for meaning. They're seeking to transcend themselves and to be connected to something greater. And Lisa Marchiano, who's a therapist, and she helped write a book called When Kids Say They're Trans. She's great. And she talked a lot about this in my series, this idea that, the idea of being trans means you can transcend yourself and become something else. So of course it fits into that idea that people are seeking spiritual fulfillment. They're seeking something beyond themselves. They're seeking to explore an identity beyond their mere physical reality. And I think that that's natural. And I think that of course it leads to some of this.
As you evoke the imagery of transcending oneself, I'm remembering speaking with a young girl who confided in me that she believes she's a furry, and man, was that a test for me, because I'm like, I can barely make sense of the gender issue, let alone the furry issue.
Yeah.
But I actually came to be very fascinated by her thought process, because she told me about which she didn't know the word, but she told me about her experiences with lucid dreaming, and at times in her dreams embodying fantastical beings or interacting with fantastical beings as herself. And I was like taken away on this mystical adventure and really honestly understanding like why she would believe that she is a furry, that she's not fully human. And as someone who believes in genderless souls, now I don't believe that our souls are completely detached from being human, but believing in genderless souls, I can understand the desire to want to transcend the male-female duality and merge with one's soul. Whether you believe in that or not, it's kind of cool to think about. And that's pretty much the only way that I can make sense of this desire. Well, and then I think the second way I can make sense of this desire to transcend one's biological sex is also, I think there are implicit biases among the sexes towards one another. I think there's a lot of tension between males and females in our society, and perhaps in an effort to avoid that, men are wanting just to become women, and women are wanting to become men, and just avoid their personal, I don't know, qualms or responsibilities with dealing with themselves or the opposite sex.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think, like I said, there are a lot of factors that lead, especially young people, to want to identify out of their birth sex, and it really has exploded. I mean, there's a huge percentage of increase, particularly among young girls, but also there's a huge increase among boys too, which doesn't get talked a lot about. Some people say that this is just patriarchy in a dress, and it's just kind of a men's rights movement, but that neglects the fact that there are many young boys who also are transitioned, who are also very lost. And this idea of a lot of them do believe in a kind of like a gendered soul, even if they wouldn't articulate it that way. But I mean, I think that's a good way to conceptualize it, because there's something supposedly in them that doesn't match their body, and so therefore they want to change their body to align with that thing, which breaks down pretty quickly if once you start considering this idea of being gender fluid, or or changing whenever you want, or non-binary, like it all gets very, very confusing. But yeah, I think there's a number of factors that you're right, that lead people to start identifying in this way.
And when considering the pushback, how does the Christian right play a role, like, in the pushback against this ideology and the overall power struggles that we see in postmodernism?
Yeah, well, as I kind of mentioned earlier, alluded to, that there are different people coming at this for different reasons, and I think that's good. Even if we don't fully align, I think that's fine. A lot of people, I've seen a lot of comments saying like, well, God made males and females, therefore that's why we're opposed to this. I obviously don't agree about the God part, but I'm not sure that matters too much in terms of why people oppose this, unless it then leads them to act in an authoritarian manner in some other way. But if we can just if we can just stop kids from being medicalized in this way, and stop, lessen the rate of detransition by not pushing this on so many people, because adults also can get indoctrinated into this ideology and then detransition. I think that's just ultimately a good thing. So whether it comes from the Christian right, or secular atheists, or even some people on the left, centrists, libertarians, whoever, I think that as long as we're aligning in these ways, we can disagree about just about anything else. But when it comes to what I would say are the most important issues, I'm not sure. Maybe talk to me in 5 years and I might have a different opinion, but I'm not sure it matters why people are coming at this, as long as we're all stopping the harm from being done.
Well, I suppose only each of us really knows why we're coming at this, and probably it's I think probably each person has a pretty profound, deep reason for the opinions that they hold on this issue, on the issue of gender, because it's just so fundamental to who we are as humans. And I think I just mean that a little bit more in the more like material reality of just like we are male and female, just very basic.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's integral to our persons. And how would you summarize why you are making this, or you have been making this one of your personal missions?
Yeah, I guess there are a few reasons. The primary two would be, one, as we talked about, I grew up with fundamentalists. I grew up in a very authoritarian kind of environment, and I'm just naturally allergic to all of that. And so whenever I see that, whenever I see a cultish mentality or really strong groupthink that says, you can't think that way, you can't say this thing, I just have a reaction to it. It's a very visceral, kind of reaction, because I don't like other people to tell me what to do. And I don't want other people to be told what to do. And so then when you loop in this idea of not only are people being told what to do or not to do, and being shamed for not agreeing that, children should be basically butchered and sterilized. Then that brings in the other element, is that I'm a human being like everyone else, and I care about vulnerable populations. And when you start looking into this, it's incredible in the worst kind of way that it's happening. And so, when I see a problem like that, I just naturally want to do something to help stop it. So those would be the two main reasons: is this kind of group think that I'm allergic to, and I want people to be free to do what they want, and also the fact that ideology can cause people to enact real physical harm, and that we should all be concerned about that physical harm. That would be the other reason.
One catchphrase that I've seen lately is "awake, not woke."
Right.
And I actually have a sticker over here that says that. And awakening often has like a spiritual connotation, but I think it's just
Sure.
overall like kind of a version of woke, because woke initially actually had like good intentions, and it was meant to signal an awakening.
Right.
But now we have, I guess you could say loosely on our side of things, we have this phrase, awake, not woke.
Yeah.
What's your opinion of that distinction?
Yeah, I think you're right that initially, it was slang in the Black community that basically meant to be awakened to injustice, especially like veiled injustice or injustice that's not easily perceivable. So therefore, you're sort of woke, you're awakened to these problems that are otherwise difficult to see. In terms of the current distinction, now I think woke has sort of morphed into being synonymous with identity politics and what Helen and James have called critical social justice, or the encompassing ideology that largely comes from the university system that is based on intersectionality and identity politics. And so, yeah, I can understand why people are now saying awake, not woke, because they sort of become awakened to the problems with this ideology. And so I completely understand that and can appreciate that phrase.
I definitely appreciate it. And I have a sticker just here, with the phrase on it. But upon reflection, I also think that perhaps awake and woke are just kind of like a holier than thou kind of identity.
Sure. Yeah.
As something I want to be cautious of. And, considering the Nietzsche quote of staring into the abyss and perhaps it's staring back at you. When you consider that quote, like, do you protect yourself as you stare into the abyss, or do you allow that monster to gaze back at you?
To me, these days, that monster is social media and the internet in general, which I think has been a net negative. And so I do try to limit my time on it because I don't think it's healthy, especially when you're just getting a lot of angry people, slinging accusations at you, misrepresenting you. It's really easy to get drawn into that abyss and to want to correct what mistakes or lies that people are telling about you online. But I don't think it's really worth it. I mean, I do it a little bit, but often I just say something funny and then I block the person because I don't want to get sucked into that any more than I already am. And frankly, if we had an older model like we used to have of making films and series where you make them and you put them out for theaters or whatever, I would love that. I don't like being on social media. I wouldn't be on social media hardly at all if it weren't for the fact that I have to use it to promote myself and the films that I make or videos. But that is the current model. I mean, it's good in that it allows more people to be able to tell interesting stories, but it's bad in a lot of other ways. And I think that's one of them, is just that we get so wrapped up in a lot of like infighting and a lot of negativity and there's just so much outrage online that I think that people have to take a break. And I try to do that every week, if not every day, in some capacity, because I think that's the only way to kind of stay sane and healthy. Which, by the way, I think is part of what leads to kids identifying, as the opposite sex or non-binary or whatever, is they get so online and they're so in their heads and they start learning these things that they can transcend their problems by just identifying out of them or whatever. If they were less online and they were horseback riding more or doing jujitsu or playing a sport or whatever, we would see less of this. I'm totally convinced of that.
I can imagine so. And I guess in short, your answer is that the monster is Twitter.
Social media in general, but yeah, Twitter is particularly bad.
Yeah. During a couple of the episodes you filmed, there were two quotes from Eric Hoffer about mass movements. One about mass movements robbing their followers of the present moment, and another about how they may not always acknowledge God, and at times they will deny God, but they must have a devil. They must have an enemy. Could you share more about what that means and how it's done? And would you say that critical theory and gender identity theory are kind of like devils in this context?
Well, so that was for the Woke Reformation. I love Eric Hoffer. That was from the book The True Believer, which is really, really good. It's mostly about how authoritarian regimes rise, but also just how groupthink overtakes people and they start demonizing anyone who isn't in the group. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that critical race theory or critical theory or gender identity ideology are the devil so much. I mean, they can act that way, and for like the anti-woke right, let's say, or certain gender critical factions, those things are kind of a devil and they need to be defeated at all costs, which I'm sympathetic to. But what I was using that quote for was this idea that, in particular about race, is that the devil is, as you've mentioned a couple times, the white heterosexual male. And that's basically the devil. Whoever is at the top of the power hierarchy is kind of the devil. And so as a mass movement, we need to join together in all these various identities to defeat that devil. So that's really more why I use that particular quote.
Hmm. And I've heard critical theory and gender identity theory called dangerous ideas, and I'm obviously sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I do worry that deeming any ideas dangerous, or that they should be purged from society, or that it's almost like another version of the witch trial. I worry that, I mean, I'm not going to change, necessarily what I say, but I consider if calling any ideas dangerous and saying we need to fight against this, and at times I'll hear that they shouldn't be taught in higher education, for instance. Could this lead? Well, I think we know this does lead to public shaming, and standing apart from certain modern day ideas. I see a little bit of a parallel there to Christians saying that they are in the world but not of the world. It's like once you stand apart from something and you deem it dangerous, I think there's a similar mechanism that's at play. But I'm curious if you see it that way, if maybe you see it a little bit differently from your perspective and from your upbringing. Essentially, is when you say that critical theory and gender identity theory are dangerous ideas,
Right.
are you sort of setting the scene for yet not you specifically, but setting the scene for another witch trial, perhaps where we're shaming ideas and by extension shaming people and purging? Yeah.
No, I mean, so one, I don't think that. So I think these ideas certainly, they're not dangerous in and of themselves, in that if you hear this idea, you're going to go act in a harmful way. I mean, so they're not dangerous in that sense, but they're dangerous in the sense that they're infectious and that they indoctrinate people, or the people use them to indoctrinate others into ultimately harmful behavior. So I think they can be dangerous in that way. But I'm not for. It gets tricky because it depends on how you talk about some of these things. But for critical race theory, for instance, I'm not for banning critical race theory, full stop. But the reality is that it's, when it comes to younger people's educations, K through 12, they're not teaching it as in they're teaching a subject. It's just infused in every aspect or many aspects of what they're doing. So it's the orientation or foundation for which they're teaching anything else. That's why math can suddenly become racist. So it's not that they're teaching critical race theory. So that the left has that right. They're not teaching critical race theory. It's already infused in how they teach. It's actually more of a framework, or, as Lyle Asher said, a lens through which they view everything. So I'm for getting that out of the schools and just having a more neutral, or maybe not neutral, but classically liberal approach to education and teaching kids what they need to survive and thrive in the world. But when it comes to banning books or banning certain ideas, I'm not really for that. Generally speaking, I don't think. There might be some exceptions, but so yeah, I don't think that's a particularly good idea.
I think it's a slippery slope, and it depends on the individual and perhaps the group's intentions. Back to intent versus impact.
Yeah.
In your series of interviews through the Woke Reformation and Uncomfortable Truths, what has been your experience, and what's your creative process in making all of these connections and weaving all of these points of view and all these stories together in a meaningful way?
Well, in terms of the connections, I've just been really lucky to be friends with with Peter Boghossian. He's supported my work in a lot of ways, and for the most part, most of the connections I've made have just been through him. So shout out to Pete. And then subsequently, I was able to get a hold of people like Daryl Davis and others. And so then once I got someone like, Douglas Murray, for instance, in the series, then other people were more likely to want to do it. So that's how I've been able to make some really great connections. In terms of the process, I'd like to try to read and listen to voices on both sides of a particular subject, whether it's, woke ideology or critical theory. I have actually behind me a stack of books that are sort of promoting the woke side of things. So I really, I'm not sure if it was a waste of my time to read those books. It was certainly kind of exhausting, but I was curious what their arguments were, if they had anything interesting to say, if there was anything I agreed with. The answer to all of that is no, but it was still an interesting exercise. And I don't think, as John Stuart Mill said, he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. So I think we have to know opposing arguments to our positions. So I think that's really important. And, I've been criticized a number of times, even by, close friends of mine who say, well, you shouldn't insert yourself into the film as a documentary filmmaker. You need to be objective and not. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not a journalist. I'm a filmmaker, and I got into film actually making fictional narratives. And I only, over the last few years, started to make non-fictional documentaries. So I suppose I have a different approach, and I'm fine with it. I don't mind people knowing my opinion. I don't mind pushing for a particular viewpoint. That seems to be frowned upon because I guess people are thinking that I need to be some kind of journalist, but I've never labeled myself as such, and I don't think of myself that way. So I don't really mind. I'm pushing for the values that I care about, and so that's what informs how I approach these topics.
Well, I respect that, and I see filmmaking as a means of capturing perspective, visually and holistically. And you're capturing a multitude of perspectives, and I love that you weave your own hero's journey into that.
Thank you.
Where can people find your work, Travis?
On YouTube, it's at The Signal Productions, I believe, and so that's where a lot of my stuff is. But then I have a lot more exclusive content on Locals. So if you sign up, you can get access to that, and that's travisbrown.locals.com. And then you can find me on the usual places, Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming on the show today. It was a real treat for me, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.